Everybody, thank you all for coming. I'm going to try this again. I'm Martha Cutter, and thanks to everybody for coming. This is the second of the last brown bag talk of faculty work this semester. I have a flyer for our next upcoming talk, which is Greg Perot, who will be talking about The Black Avenger, a Western tradition of novelty. So I think that'll be really interesting and exciting. I'll pass around this flyer. And,
first published on Warscapes?
Exactly, that is published in Warscapes. Thank you, Basti. So I have the privilege of introducing our dear colleague, Clare Eby, today. And then she will talk once I introduce her. So Clare Eby's research has centered on the progressive era, and it has always had a strong interdisciplinary component. Her most recent book, which is called Untitled Choice Do Us Part, Marriage Reform in the Progressive Era, was published in the University of Chicago Press's History series, a very impressive series, difficult to get into. I think I wrote that letter and editor at one point. He just laughed at me. He's like, "Oh, Cutter, you're such an idiot." Seriously. Anyway, Clare is also, that was all. Anyway, Clare is also the author of Dreiser and Veblen's Saboteurs of the Status Quo, which came out from University of Missouri Press in a long time ago. Okay. She edited the Dreiser edition of The Genius, bringing to print for the first time Dreiser's original version of his most autobiographical novel, based on the holograph manuscript. And she also edited the Norton critical edition of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. She is also co-editor of the Cambridge History of the American Novel, which is a great volume, and the Cambridge Companion to Dreiser, which is also a wonderful volume. Several years ago, Clare became frustrated by having no time to keep up with contemporary novels, she wrote me, and decided to make work into play by signing up to teach courses in recent American fiction. So her talk today is drawn from her current research, and it marks Clare's efforts to reinvent herself as a scholar of contemporary literature and the law. So I think we all look forward to this talk, and let's give Clare a big hand.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to have so many people turn out at this insanely busy time of year. And a special thanks to Martha for inviting me and for her expert organizational and PR efforts on all of our behalf. So as my former students in the room know, I'm pretty obsessed with the corporate form. And this all started during my last sabbatical. I was reading about, around at the same time, Citizens United, the 2010 decision, which extended the free speech rights of corporations by allowing them to pour unlimited money into elections. And also Richard Powers' Gain, which traces the history of a corporation over several centuries. So this is a sort of conjunction that can only happen while on sabbatical, when we actually have time to indulge in idle curiosity and not just frantically prepare for classes and write for deadlines. And reading these two texts together very much inspired my current book project on corporate personhood. So what I aim to do is to bring literature and the law together to show the ethical and epistemological crises caused by the corporate person's non-accountability to the human person. So my overarching argument, which is still in very preliminary stages, is that corporate personhood provides a dangerous framework for extending rights to corporations, and in doing so, it diminishes the rights of actual human citizens. And that's what I mean by the zero-sum game. So Citizens United's 5-4 decision infuriated me, but I was electrified by Justice Stevens' dissent. He argued that corporations don't deserve free speech rights because they aren't human, and he made the refreshingly obvious point, and I quote, that corporations have no consciences, no beliefs, no feelings, no thoughts, no desires. So it's differences like that between the corporate and the human person that interest me, and contemporary fiction spotlights these differences in many different ways. In Gain, for instance, the Powers novel, the narrative takes the form of a Bildungsroman, only the protagonist is a humble family-owned soap maker in colonial America that comes of age as a massive consumer goods conglomerate in the late 20th century. This company, enjoying a centuries-long lifespan, is named, conveniently enough, the Clare Corporation. So I was destined to write this project.
Is it spelled like your name?
It is. It's spelled the right way, I might say. So while on one hand, Gain is a postmodern spoof, the Buildings Roman Forum also makes readers think seriously about how a corporate life cycle is and is not like that of humans. So Powers identifies the day that Clare incorporates in 1857 as a milestone. Once the company becomes what Powers calls one composite body, it also becomes a, quote, protected person, unquote. Those protections include such legally granted privileges as limited liability and immortality, which give Clare advantages over human persons. The other Clare, not me. As Ambrose Bierce quipped in the Devil's Dictionary, corporation, an ingenious device for obtaining individual profit without individual responsibility. So after Clare incorporates, it starts changing from protagonist to antagonist, and this new identity emerges, of course, only in relation to human characters. Throughout Gain, Clare's robust life story runs alongside a far more human story of frailty, illness, and death. Residing in the Midwestern city where the company is headquartered in the late 20th century, Laura Bodie is dying of cancer that is probably caused by Clare products and or by its environmental pollutants. Probably, but not conclusively caused. The crucial point is that Clare cannot be proven to have caused Laura's cancer. And even if it could be proven, what good would it do? Laura would still die, and the company survive whatever fines or penalties a court ordered. And then in a crucial scene, Laura's former husband sneaks into the headquarters and makes his way to the company's nerve center, the boardroom. He fantasizes about throwing a bomb, only to realize that the destruction of company property, or even killing off a number of executives, would do absolutely no good. It would not harm Clare in the least. So the problem that Powers identifies is that while humans have created the corporate form and endowed it with all kinds of special privileges, the corporation can literally get away with murder. A Lord Chancellor captured this dilemma perfectly in the late 18th century when he noted that a corporation has no soul to damn and no body to kick. So it's the law, and specifically the legal doctrine of corporate personhood, that gives corporations power over humans and unaccountability to us. And the legal history actually extends for centuries before Citizens United. So this gets a little bit hazy. But I'm going to talk now a little bit about legal fictions and metaphors before speeding through a few landmark Supreme Court decisions. This is not the place for extended close readings of legal rationales, but I'll try to give some sense of how the court actually contradicts itself repeatedly in upholding the rights of corporate persons. So I will then sketch the arguments of the two chapters I have drafted, and finally, much more briefly, explain the other two that I have planned. So, legal scholars and justices describe corporate personhood as a legal fiction. The phrase legal construct might make more sense to us, but the fact that lawyers admit corporate personhood is a fiction is, of course, very provocative for a literary scholar. While lawyers rarely talk about it this way, corporate personhood is also, of course, a metaphor, which one of my reference books describes as a comparison that's not actually articulated as a comparison. So in other words, corporations are not people, but corporate personhood pretends that they are like people without, of course, uttering the word like. So a simile would actually be a lot more honest. The fact that the metaphor doesn't actually articulate a comparison helps to sustain the fiction that corporations are like humans, and the fiction in turn sustains considerable duplicity. So there are two levels of duplicity embedded in this legal fiction of corporate personhood that I'm concerned with. First, even if corporations resemble humans in some ways, for instance, both can enter into contracts or be sued, they decidedly do not resemble us in many other ways. They have no conscience, no beliefs, no feelings, and so on. But the metaphor of corporate personhood obscures those differences as it pretends an absolute equivalence. Second, it's only because corporations are understood as like people in the first place that they can claim constitutional rights. So corporate personhood has also become a pillar of neoliberalism, And we can see that by examining how the court's rationale in Citizens United is predicated on two additional metaphors, I would say toxic metaphors, economic metaphors. One of them that the court relies on is the idea that money is a form of speech, which I just think is outrageous. Justice Kennedy, writing for the majority, is fond of emphasizing that the Constitution protects free speech, not free speakers. So I suppose that means it protects money itself, not the people who have money. So while I'm not a fan of originalist interpretations, I am pretty confident that the founders did not actually think of money as protected speech. So the second toxic neoliberal metaphor that Citizens United enshrines is what Kennedy calls the marketplace of ideas, which makes me really crazy. And this marketplace of ideas theoretically permits every interested party to contribute her 2 cents during an election season. The problem, of course, is that while you or I may in fact contribute 2 cents, the Koch brothers can contribute 2 million through corporate venues. So this incommensurability illustrates how the corporate person has become the neoliberal person par excellence. Neoliberalism denies that material differences of access, class position, race, ethnicity, or gender give any economic player advantage over another. According to neoliberalism, we're all equals in the marketplace of ideas. Except that, to borrow a phrase from Orwell, some people are more equal than others, which is precisely what the legal fiction of corporate personhood allows. Excuse me, just very serious cotton mouth today. Probably caffeine is good. Well, actually, no, water would be great. Thank you so much. So how did we get to this point? I'm primarily interested in contemporary iterations of corporate personhood, but law is, of course, based on precedent. And in order to understand this legal fiction, I need not simply to examine British law, out of which US law emerged, but also canon law, where I'm really out of my league. My understanding is that the earliest iterations of corporate law go back to the church as a corporate body. And there's also a long tradition of understanding municipalities and universities as corporate bodies. So the idea of a persona ficta goes back at least to Pope Innocent IV. According to legal historian Morton Horwitz, however, the origins of corporate personhood in the US lie in a fascinating treatise called Political Theories of the Middle Ages, written by a German scholar, Otto Guericke, and translated into English in 1900. So what all this means is that in order to talk about the last 10 years or so, I have to go back at least as far as the Middle Ages. And I welcome your thoughts about how to handle this, because I do not intend for this to be a multi-volume endeavor. But my working assumption is that I'm going to have an introductory chapter which is going to provide sort of a telescoped history somehow. Or perhaps I can farm that out. But anyway, so American legal writing about corporations, including Supreme Court decisions, draw from a large array of terms which are not used consistently. And I'm going to try to simplify these terms as much as possible. But there are theories about the corporation as artificial, others about it as fictitious, and considerable debate as to whether it is a, quote, real entity, unquote, at all. But broadly speaking, American law has developed 3 different theories of the relationship between corporations and humans, which I will now sketch for you very briefly. Is this spiked, Martha?
No, it's very.
Okay, excellent.
There's a little bud.
Thank you. So the first theory is called the Concession Theory, and this prevailed through most of the 19th century. So this was before there were general laws of incorporation. And so each corporation was created by a distinct legislative act. And so in other words, the state had to concede its existence. A decision called Trustees of Dartmouth College versus Woodward in 1819 exemplifies this first theory. Chief Justice John Marshall said, a corporation is an artificial being existing only in contemplation of law. Now, what may surprise modern listeners is that Marshall takes for granted that the corporation will also be, in his words, beneficial to the country. That's because until the late 19th century, incorporation would be conceded only if an institution would serve some clear public benefit. Justice Marshall also describes the corporation as having individuality, But as legal scholar Elizabeth Pullman explains, that's a far cry from treating it as an actual legal person. She and others point out that under the concession theory, the now common notion of corporations having rights, much less constitutional rights, would be preposterous. So states began passing general incorporation laws in the late 19th century, and so incorporation became a lot more routine, and so it no longer seemed to be this special privilege conceded by the state. So at this point, a second legal understanding of the corporation evolved called the Aggregate Theory, under which the for-profit organization assumes status as an actual legal person. So the idea that a corporation consists of the aggregate total of the individuals who comprise it, this opens the door for claiming constitutional protection, because it can then be argued that defending the rights of the individual humans making up a corporation necessitates protecting the rights of the corporation itself. So personally, I don't see how the aggregate theory squares with democratic principles. It sounds to me like one person getting 2 votes, but this is the rationale. So in any case, the aggregate theory crystallized in a landmark case of 1886, Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad, which some of you have read. Attorneys for the railroad successfully argued that tax assessors discriminated in charging their client higher rates on land than what human persons paid. So in doing so, they pulled off one of the greatest outrages in the history of US law, because they grounded their case on the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which was, of course, one of the Reconstruction Amendments intended to protect former slaves. As if that were not contemptible enough, in the first 50 years after Santa Clara, when the Supreme Court invoked the 14th Amendment, over half of the time it was to extend the rights of corporate persons, and fewer than 0.5% to protect African Americans. So the third legal theory of the corporation as a so-called real entity developed in the early 20th century. According to this interpretation, the corporation is an independent entity with an existence apart from both owners and state. In an often cited 1911 Harvard Law Review article, Arthur Macon asserts that while a corporation may be artificial, it's also quite real, which he explained by way of another analogy. An artificial lake, he said, is still a real lake because you can swim in it, unlike in an imaginary lake, which you cannot swim in. Likewise, Macon argues, and I quote, although corporate personality is a fiction, the entity which is personified is no fiction. So corporate personality is therefore, he concludes, a fiction founded upon fact. Gets a little head splitting. Contemporary legal scholar Susanna Ripken sums up the practical consequences of this real entity theory very nicely. She says, as a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts, the corporation is a real person qualitatively different in kind from the human persons who are part of its makeup. So I know I don't need to sell a group of humanities scholars on the importance of history, but the legal history of corporate personhood has had extremely practical consequences because the court draws from these 3 theoretical models, concession, aggregate, and real entity theory, in quite inconsistent ways. Taken together, they are entirely illogical. So to illustrate the point, I now turn to a 2014 decision that builds on Citizens United and maybe even more pernicious, Burwell versus Hobby Lobby, which extends corporate rights to the realm of religious freedom. So in Hobby Lobby, the Department of Health and Human Services filed suit against 3 corporations owned by Christians who had denied day-after contraceptive coverage to female employees, and they cited religious objections to abortion, and they considered this an abortifacient. So Health and Human Services claimed, and I think correctly, that the corporations thus violated the Affordable Care Act mandate to provide preventative health care. But in another 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court agreed with the corporate lawyers that providing day-after medication violated the corporate owners' religious beliefs. So my monograph includes a chapter on Hobby Lobby, which I read through and alongside of Mohsin Hamid's brilliant 2007 novel, The Reluctant Fundamentalist. and I argue that capitalism has become the United States' signature brand of fundamentalism and that the faith is sustained by the legal fiction of corporate personhood. Before returning to Hobby Lobby, I should briefly explain what I mean about capitalist fundamentalism. So Hofstadter describes the core tenet of the fundamentalist mind, whether secular or religious, as beginning with a definition of that which is absolutely right and then looking at the world only through that lens. So I think a similar sense of inerrancy has become the default assumption regarding capitalism, which is widely assumed to be not only the superior, but also the inevitable way to structure the economy. Advocates of both capitalist and religious fundamentalism consider their respective views to be infallible, universal, and commonsensical truths accessible to anyone who opens their eyes. Both groups gravitate toward Manichaean interpretations and disregard cultural or historical differences. Moreover, with the spread of neoliberalism, capitalism has become evangelical, using mechanisms like the IMF and the World Bank to disperse its dogma across the globe. But it was the reluctant fundamentalists that got me thinking about capitalist fundamentalism in the first place. The entire novel is something of a Rorschach blot, playing with readers' presumptions about Islamic fundamentalism. But in a crucial scene, the protagonist and narrator, a Pakistan-born and Princeton-educated Wall Street analyst named Changes, is instructed by a colleague to focus on the fundamentals, which basically means to keep his eye on the bottom line. While much has been written about how the reluctant fundamentalist engages complicated questions of identity and nation, I'm interested in how the fundamentalism practiced by Changes' firm, which he correctly identifies as a creed, fosters the zero-sum game, placing the interests of corporations over those of humans. So only such a cultural climate as Hamid sketches, one that literally worships capitalism, could generate the Hobby Lobby decision. In extending religious rights to corporations, Samuel Alito, writing for the majority, draws inconsistently from the three theories of corporate identity that I sketched above, the concession, aggregate, and real entity theories. Explicitly, though, he only references one of them, because if he explicitly referenced all three, the house of cards would come falling down. So the one that he references is the late 19th century aggregate theory. He refers to what he calls the familiar legal fiction of corporate personhood, and he says, it is important to keep in mind that the purpose of this fiction is to provide protection for human beings. And so that is basically aggregate theory 101, because it's saying the corporation consists of those individuals in it, and so in order to protect those individuals, we have to protect the rights of the corporation. But the Hobby Lobby ruling also draws piecemeal from the two other theories of corporations, and this is where it starts to become incoherent. So Alito admits that a corporation can't pray or worship, yet he claims the organization can still have religious objectives. So if you go to the Hobby Lobby webpage, for instance, you can find, in addition to a 30% off coupon, that the corporation is committed to honoring the Lord in all we do by operating the company in a manner consistent with biblical principles, and also providing a return on the family's investment, sharing the Lord's blessings with our employees. So such corporate statements, I guess, are evidence of the actual religion of the corporation. But the problem here is that if a corporation itself, and not just its owners, can pursue religious objectives, then that would actually make it a real and independent entity, qualitatively different from and independent of its owners, which would mean that it couldn't be this aggregate being after all. Alito doesn't admit that he's drawing from the real entity theory as well, because doing so would invalidate his premise of protecting the religious expression of the owners enabled by the aggregate theory. So most bizarrely, Alito also draws upon the earliest model, the early 19th century concession theory. He says modern corporate law does not require for-profit corporations to pursue profit at the expense of everything else. Corporations, in his account, are marvelous shapeshifters, one moment for profit, another not for profit, And in describing the charitable and humanitarian causes on which corporations voluntarily spend their profits, Alito updates the 19th century concession theory, according to which the corporation serves vital civic functions. But there's an important difference. Alito's 21st century corporation doesn't do so because it has to in order to be recognized by the state. His kindler and gentler corporate entity does good because it chooses to do so. So as in Citizens United, in Hobby Lobby, a quantifiable corporate expense. In the case of Citizens United, political contributions. In the case of Hobby Lobby, philanthropic donations. These quantifiable corporate expenses are used to claim intangible constitutional rights. While I find the logic contemptible, the consequence is even worse. Hobby Lobby extends the zero-sum game because affirming the corporate person's constitutional free exercise of religion permits the court to deny flesh and blood women employees their statutory right to ACA mandated coverage. So the reluctant fundamentalist clarifies how prioritizing corporations becomes the pretext for ignoring labor. The protagonist, Changes, is a star financial analyst whose job is to determine the value of client companies. He says at one point, our mandate was to determine how much fat could be cut through headcount reduction and other measures. So the bureaucratic euphemisms are frightening, and so is his response. I felt enormously powerful, he recalls. Would these workers be fired? We, indirectly, of course, would help decide. So Changes explains that his job leaves no time for sympathy. To be perfectly honest, he says, the compassionate pangs I felt for soon-to-be redundant workers were not overwhelming in their frequency. Our job required a degree of commitment that left one with rather limited time for such distractions. So this is the logical consequence of the zero-sum game. Actual human beings are reduced to distractions. So I hope I've given you some sense of how, founded on this legal fiction of personhood and supported by 2 centuries of Supreme Court rulings, the corporation has come to enjoy a peculiar status of privileged yet disembodied personhood against which human persons do not stand a chance, as well as how literature can help dramatize the problems. But the only 2 literary texts I know that provide sustained examinations of corporate personhood per se are Powers' novel Gain that I spoke about earlier, and a 2014 volume of poetry by Jenna Osman called Corporate Relations. And like Powers, Osman is very well versed in the economic and legal history of corporations. She actually quotes from Supreme Court decisions throughout the volume. The opening poem, titled The Beautiful Life of Persona Ficta, draws attention to the incommensurability of human and corporate persons through wonderful lines like these. A corporation says, hey, I'm talking to you, as an individual speaks through a spokesperson. Or, a corporation has an enthusiasm for ethical behavior as a creature has economic interests only. Or, my favorite, a corporation warms the bed and wraps its arms around you and just wants to spoon as a natural human wants to organize profits. But without specifically engaging corporate personhood, many other novels expose the zero-sum game by spotlighting the excesses of corporations while offering briefs for normative humanity. And I think it's not a coincidence that so many of these are actually dystopias, including Atwood's Oryx and Crake, Chang Rae Lee's On Such a Full Sea, Steingart's Super Sad True Love Story, and Helen Phillips' The Beautiful Bureaucrat, and also, of course, Dave Eggers' The Circle. I hope to write about all of these. So I've also drafted a chapter on the idea of corporate immortality and Super Sad True Love Story. And I know the immortality thing sounds really weird, but this is actually one of the specific attributes that the law understands as unique to corporations. Limited liability being of course another. So the idea of corporate immortality reaches back at least into medieval canon law. First religious institutions, then boroughs, municipalities, and guilds, and then universities were theorized as corporate bodies that could exist in perpetuity. So a primary benefit of incorporation was the ability to transmit property over generations. So British common law continued this tradition. Blackstone famously called the corporation a person that never dies. Within US law, corporate immortality is enshrined in Dartmouth, the 1819 case I discussed above. As Justice Marshall explained in Dartmouth, corporate immortality allows for a perpetual succession of individuals capable of acting for the promotion of the particular object like one immortal being. So in other words, what this meant was that benefactors of Dartmouth could be assured that their donations would remain with the college in perpetuity. So I don't object to the logic of these early rationales for corporate immortality, all of which had in mind, as you could see, specifically nonprofit corporations. But a peculiarity of corporate law is that the for-profit corporation continues to benefit from centuries of precedent that made sense for nonprofit corporations. So corporate immortality is perhaps the clearest example of how the law allows the institution to have it both ways, gaining privileges of humans while eluding our responsibilities and limitations. So I use Super Sad True Love Story to argue that corporate immortality is an affront to what Hannah Arendt called the human condition of mortality. Steingart's novel is a hilarious and offensive satire of social media, sexual objectification, and neoliberalism run amok. It is also, I argue, an affirmation of the human condition in all its fragility. The overweight and neurotic protagonist Lenny Abramoff opens the novel by declaring, "Today I've made a major decision. I am not going to die." It sounds like a ridiculous pronouncement, but it turns out to actually be the gospel according to the corporation where he works, selling dechronification treatments, also known as indefinite life extensions, to wealthy clients. So the corporate creed that money equals life refers to the fact that clients identified as HNWIs, or high net worth individuals, and only HNWIs, can afford the indefinite life extension. So those with enough money can make a bid at living forever, just like corporations. The novel has two human characters who are associated with immortality. One is Lenny's love interest and co-narrator, 24-year-old Korean-American Eunice Park. While Super Sad discloses more, far more, about Lenny's sexual preferences than most readers care to know, his disturbing obsession with Eunice is ultimately less erotic than because she strikes him as the, quote, poster child for eternity, unquote. As he says, in some ridiculous way, I think Eunice will let me live forever. So the second human representative of immortality is Lenny's boss, friend, and part-time father figure, Joshi Goldman. But whereas Eunice represents immortality due to her tiny girlish body, Joshi does so because he's a stand-in for the corporation itself. It's called Statling Wapachung Corporation. The 60-something executive runs the company's significantly titled Post-Human Services division and has been undergoing dechronification himself, appearing younger every time Lenny sees him. So Joshi is the human embodiment of the corporate person because of what he sells, what he practices, and also because of how he mentors Lenny. You've got to sell to live, he says. So that counsel captures the complete flattening of human life and human value to a quantifiable corporate scale. Joshi also explains what not to do, as he says. Those thoughts, those books, they are the problem. You have to stop thinking and start selling. That's why all those young whizzes in the Eternity Lounge want to shove a carb-filled macaroon up your ass. You remind them of death. Acting, the humanities, it's the fallacy of merely existing. So in other words, stop being a human being, and in particular, forget about the humanities. So this terrifying advice captures what Wendy Brown terms neoliberal rationality, which in her words disseminates the model of the market to all domains and activities and configures human beings exclusively as market actors. So the zero-sum game emerges most clearly when the objective of corporate immortality justifies the mass destruction of human beings. Early in Super Sad, a group of LNWIs, low net worth individuals, who have been evicted from their homes and have set up tents in Central Park, are slaughtered to tidy up Manhattan for the benefit of the visiting Chinese banker to whom the US is deeply in debt. The annihilated LNWIs are all poor and mostly people of color. While initially it seems as if the government ordered their slaughter, after a larger massacre called the Rupture, Lenny learns that his corporation ordered both of the mass executions. His boss, Joshi, evasively admits that which citizens were chosen to live and which to die depends on their assets. And in ordering this genocide, Joshi, as corporate proxy, also extends his own market share. He rises phoenix-like from destruction so severe that the collapse of the US government is imminent. And at this point, Joshi actually becomes the stand-in for the immortal corporation in a new way. As he sees it, the massacre of the LNWIs is just a cost of doing business. He messages executives and shareholders, cheerily explaining that the collapse of the government means great possibilities for the corporation's shareholders and top-level personnel. Creditor nations will assume control of the US, and Manhattan, cleared of all of its riffraff, will be converted into a lifestyle hub for globe-trotting HNWIs. And who's going to profit from that, Joshi asks. Stotling Wapachung Corporation, that's who. Property, security, and then us. Immortality. The ruptures created a whole new demand for not dying. So the vile corporate regime that considers human life, and especially the lives of citizens of color, expendable, demonstrates what Jody Melamed describes as racial capitalism. And Joshi's role illuminates how the immortal corporation literally profits from human destruction. So I think I'm going to actually skip this next paragraph in the interest of time, where I was going to talk about another Supreme Court decision. But so in addition to these cheery arguments that I have just sketched, I also plan to have a chapter dealing with a 2011 Supreme Court decision called Walmart versus Dukes. Dave Eggers is The Circle, and Helen Phillips is The Beautiful Bureaucrat. So what I want to get into here is the relationship between the corporate entity and the individual worker, specifically how the individuality of the worker is held against her in order to sustain corporate identity. And I do mean her quite literally. The protagonists of both novels are women, while the Walmart case involves discrimination against female employees. In the largest class action suit in American history, the court exonerated Walmart from the charge that male managers paid women less and promoted them less frequently than their male counterparts. So much of the court's rationale was based on the fact that Walmart's official policy prohibited such discrimination. So in other words, corporate identity was held to be more consequential than the actions of individual male managers. But when it came to the female employees' charges, the court flipped its reasoning, making the bizarre argument that the women actually could not file a class action suit because they were, as individuals, too various to constitute a class. I mean, I don't know how these people sleep at night. I really don't. So this chapter, this hypothetical chapter, will also examine how the female protagonists in The Circle and The Beautiful Bureaucrat respond to what organizational theorists refer to as concerted control. It's a very ugly term, but it's a useful concept. So unlike earlier hierarchical methods of disciplining employees, under neoliberalism, employees exercise concerted control over themselves by buying into corporate values and other forms of self-management. And as The Circle demonstrates, authoritarian or paternalistic corporate policies are completely unnecessary once employees voluntarily sacrifice their individuality to the corporate whole. And what I find particularly important is how Eggers envisions the corporation appropriating the language of humanity. The corporation calls itself not a workplace, but a human place. And the official policy is that at The Circle, humanity is respected, and humanity, as someone tellingly adds, is as important as any stock price. So just one final paragraph describing my fourth chapter in speculative chapter. So I want to focus on Oryx and Craik and Chang-Rae Lee's On Such a Full Sea. And both of them involve pharmaceutical conglomerates so powerful that they structure the entire social world and also sustain stratified income inequality. In Oryx and Craik, pharmaceuticals have created what are called compounds, where affluent staff live comfortably in fortified communities, complete with schools, entertainment, and a fully privatized military called, appropriately, the Corpse Corps. Part of the appeal of the compounds is that they're not plebe lands where the 99% live. And Lee also examines social stratification and class anxiety in On Such a Full Sea, in which middle-class workers live in rigidly structured communities called settlements. Such workers also practice conservative control because they fear falling beneath their settlement, and also because of a minuscule hope of rising above it. About 1% of the settlement population tests out, allowing them to ascend to the wealthy and corporate-run charter communities above them. Far more often, however, settlement workers fall down to the wild counties where there is no rule of law and one might as easily be, spoiler alert, murdered in a sleepy motel or fed to dogs by a family of vegetarian circus performers. I just love that. And if anyone can explain that part of the novel to me, I would really appreciate it. Hilarious but bizarre. So what Lee's three populations share, the settlement charter and county populations, is knowledge that they will acquire a fatal disease called simply C. So the letter, of course, evokes cancer, but also corporation or capitalism itself. While corporate ascendancy breeds the social stratification and income inequality that lies at the center of both of these novels, Oryx and Full Sea, more important to my project is that the pharmaceutical giants in both novels actually create public health crises so that they can profit from selling drugs. And I'm struggling with how to frame this chapter, but I want to explore how the corporate body preys off of the human body and how both Atwood and Lee portray the corporate capitalist system as itself a sickness. The corporate body is diseased, and capitalism can't stay alive without the people it destroys. Corporations in these novels destroy humanities in two ways, by the production of illness and also by the production of income inequality. Whether because sick people die or because consumers can no longer afford to buy pharmaceuticals, Atwood and Lee suggest that corporations are killing themselves as well as humanity, which, depressingly enough, sounds like a happy ending to the zero-sum game. So thank you for your patience.
Questions? I'm going to throw one out here.
Please.
Because I love Oryx and Craig.
I do too.
One of the things that strikes me as slightly different about that novel, maybe we can talk about that, is that the corporation is to some extent destroyed from within by the genius scientist who I
Right.
can't think of his name
Craig.
right now. What? Craig, that's right, there we go. And then creates this kind of crisis that then leads the corporation to
Right.
implode. And so is that different when
Well,
somebody
yeah.
from within the corporation decides that these entities, which have been acting as human, need to be destroyed in the same way you could destroy a human being?
Well, it's funny you say that, because this is one of the things that I have struggled with, because I feel that the only way I can make this argument is that I'm going to actually have to in some way be defending Craig, who's the mad scientist and just complete whack job who destroys everything. But I mean, I think the thing that's interesting about him is that even though he absolutely is working within the corporation, but I think his motives and his interests have nothing to do with corporate motives or interests. I mean, because he's not, I mean, I think the whole profit thing, he could care less, shareholders, he could care less. But I mean, I think that is a problem, because I think you're absolutely right, it is destroyed from within. So I mean, that's just what I don't think I've fully answered your question, but that's, I mean, I'm aware it's a problem, and that's sort of what I'm thinking about.
I like the idea of Craig is not really a corporate, is really not a corporate entity. He's his own.
Particularly because he's a scientist.
Yeah, he's off on his own project.
Yeah.
Creating a post-human race.
Right.
Which is another.
Exactly. I think Chris and then.
Yeah, I was wondering if you can go back to the free speech part at the beginning, because I think that's one area where the way in which the law privileged the corporate entity over basically basic human rights becomes really salient, right? Because when we were doing AUP negotiations, we were researching academic freedom, and we had some members saying, like, why do you need academic freedom protections in a union contract? Because we have the First Amendment in the United States. What most people don't realize is the First Amendment basically protects individual citizens from the state, right? And they're basically kind of their free speech rights vis-a-vis the state. It doesn't protect them in the workplace from their employers, because employers, lo and behold, are individuals with their own free speech rights who can do things. So Breitbart could kind of attack Antifa as kind of free speech kind of killers and without a skipping a beat can defend Trump saying, I'm going to fire all NFL players who take the knee, or they should be fired by their employers, right? Because that sense of employees having no free speech rights who work for companies or any business basically is so completely and totally normalized, we don't even see it as a zone of free speech, right? And so I was wondering if you could comment on that, either as something that you're seeing as kind of a leitmotif in the literature, or something that some of your court cases or some of your secondary sources have illuminated.
Well, I mean, there's I think, I certainly haven't read all of the legal stuff, but it seems to me that there has been more written about that particular corporate appropriation of the constitutional right, the free speech right, than anything else. And one of the paragraph that I cut was actually about an earlier decision from the 70s. I'm blanking on the name right now. But this, I mean, it doesn't really answer your question, but it certainly is relevant. Let me just find the name of this one. Oh yeah, First National Bank of Boston versus Bellotti, and this actually, so this was 1978, and this actually laid crucial foundations for Citizens United in terms of, and actually when I was talking about Citizens United, I was talking about the toxic metaphors of money as speech and also the marketplace of ideas, but these actually go back at least to the Bellotti decision. And there's definitely been a whole lot written about that, and I think corporations also have. I mean, I don't know if the lawyers read it this way, but I mean, I read it with Hobby Lobby. They now have free exercise rights. They also have they've claimed other rights like against search and seizure, due process. So I mean, and I think actually a great premise for if anybody is a creative writer in the audience, I think a great premise for a dystopian novel would be when corporations gain the right to bear arms. And you want to write that one?
Oh, no.
So I mean, I'm not really sure what to say, except that I mean, there's been a lot written about the free speech, particularly, and I have to admit, when I read Citizens United, it's very, one of the things that's like very fun, very frustrating about reading these rationales is, of course, all of the justices, even when you completely disagree with their politics, they're all brilliant reasoners. And they do certainly, both in Bellotti and in Citizens United, they do make a big point about that the Constitution does not protect speakers, it protects speech. And then another thing I think is actually relevant to your question, and I don't know how widely this extends, but I know that it does apply to Citizens United. Many of the laws that pertain to corporations also pertain to labor organizations, because I guess the law sees them as similar kinds of entities. So I don't know if that gives us anything that we can use from an activist point of view, but I mean, I think that would be a way of sort of maybe thinking about getting some of this power back. But I mean, it's a great question. I'm sorry I don't have more of an answer to it. Sarah?
I'm really excited to hear about the whole shape of your book project, and I wanted to ask what you're thinking about legal personhood generally, because a lot of historical struggles have been fought over groups' lack of access to legal personhood, such as slaves.
Right.
And here now we have this legal personhood, this usurpation of certain kinds of legal personhood that is going on. So what happens to legal personhood, or what happens to struggles over legal personhood in your view in this context?
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting because if people, I mean, just citizens in general, not academics, I mean, when there's widespread, like overwhelming agreement that there should be, I mean, when people are asked, that there should be a constitutional amendment abolishing personhood for corporations. But I think the thing is that we don't often think about we don't often think about the fact that, because we're so aware of corporations, we don't often think that they're people. So, I personally think that we have to somehow try to take the whole thing down. But I don't know how we could do that, because I can understand, even like putting aside, the fact that there are roots in church law and whatnot, which makes it really complicated, but I can understand certain amount of the logic of corporate personhood, so I can understand why it's helpful to think of a corporation as a person so that they can sue or be sued and so that they can enter into contracts. And I think actually a lot of this stuff is very tied up with contract law. So, I personally would like to see corporate personhood defined in an extremely restrictive way. And there's one scholar, I think her name is Steppenwall, legal scholar. I could definitely find a name if you're interested. And she talks about, which I think is a really useful concept, what she calls normative citizenship, and that this would be something that would only apply to human beings, and that this being a way of differentiating corporate personhood. And so that is probably, something like that is probably a lot more practical than my desire, which is just to destroy the construct, especially because I admit that some of the construct serves useful purpose. So I think that I think it's a matter of really underscoring and clarifying the differences, because I do think that obviously there's all kinds of reasons why we live in the present moment, in the current climate. But I do think that this logic of shifting more and more to the corporate person means that we're going to be taking away from, and especially people who don't have much access in the first place. And it also goes back to the marketplace of ideas nonsense. And just the fact that we sort of see everything in these economic terms, and yet we see the corporation in human terms. I think Ashley was...
So this is a kind of question about the Hobby Lobby and Reluctant Fundamentalist chapter, and like the concept of capitalist fundamentalism. Because one of the things I was thinking as I was listening was about this novel that I read in Kathy's class called Capitoil. I can't remember who wrote it.
Was it Teddy Wayne?
Yeah, the novel's called Capitoil.
You wrote a good paper.
And the reason why I'm thinking about this is because I wrote about it, to be fair. But like I think one of the phrases in that novel that comes up over and over again is the zero-sum game. So I was actually even thinking about it as I was looking at your poster.
Okay.
And I think like it has this really unique way of challenging the capitalist fundamentalism concept, right? Because it kind of, and this is what I wrote in my paper, that it kind of presents this argument about productivity occurring more effectively when people work together, but in this like subtle and interesting way. So I was thinking, although it's presumptuous of me to like suggest a novel.
No, it's
that
fantastic.
might be useful for that chapter.
That's
And it's also just a
fantastic.
good read.
Yeah.
So I like recommend it.
That's great. It's actually on a pile at home, which is...
Yeah. I have it.
So I need another sabbatical so I can read all these. Yeah. No, thank you. That's fantastic.
Great talk.
Thank
I'm
you.
sorry. Were you
No,
ready?
that's fine.
When you were throughout your talk, I kept thinking of Mark Fisher, I guess by way of
Yeah.
Zizek's observation.
Yep.
It's easier
Yep.
to blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But the inevitability of capitalism is usually because it's disembodied, because it's this force that, and so I was just thinking that there's so much language that you called attention to in both the Supreme Court cases, but also in all of that fiction, whether it's Chanjez's, the bodily language he uses. To what extent do you see these novels sort of pushing against the inevitability of capitalism by way of the corporate fiction?
See, I'm not sure if, I guess I want to think that they're pushing against it, but because so many of them are these dead-end dystopias,
Right.
that I'm not sure. But I do think that I think that, and this is something that I try to do in my classes, especially my undergrad classes, and I'm very thrilled to have Taylor she was in my last Human Cost of Capitalism class. What I try to do is to use the fiction I think the fiction makes some of these problems more obvious in a way that's sort of like an abstract concept of corporate personhood seems that it's not significant. So I don't know if the novel, I mean, I think the novels are certainly critiquing these things, and I think giving us tools for looking at them and seeing what's wrong with them. But I think that's a fantastic point about the inevitability being connected with the disembodiedness. But then the flip of that being the embodied. It's a fantastic point. I'm not sure who is next. I'm so thrilled so many people have comments. Maybe Eleanor and then Dwight and Rachel. Then
My question builds on Chris's point. I'm thinking about unions as collective bargaining units. I think that's a phrase we use.
Right.
And I think I was particularly thinking about this in terms of the Walmart case you cite, where
Yeah.
like the impossibility of class action, like how do you define a class? I was wondering, is one of the problems with corporate personhood that it takes this aggregate model and makes a collective into an individual? And are some of these novels advocated, like in sort of resisting corporate personhood, do these novels sort of end up sort of reifying individuality, or do they propose kind of like other models of collectivity that might be kind of like similar to corporations but sort of fundamentally different and fundamentally more democratic, more empowering, and more socialist, obviously?
Yeah. Well, that's a very interesting question. So when you ask, like, do the novels propose other models? The first one I think about is On Such a Full Sea. Some of you have read that, which has a collective we narrator. I mean, and it's actually the people in the charter community, which is sort of like the main community, and they mostly grow fish, fancy fish, which are eaten by the wealthy charter population. So you have this, very much this collective narrator. That being said, I think there are a lot of, the narrator is not, there are a lot of kind of creepy things about the narrator. I don't think the narrator is actually, for one thing, I don't think it's a model for resistance. And the collective narrator also has this kind of weirdly voyeuristic way of looking at the central character who's named Fan and who actually sort of travels through all of these different societies. So I mean, there certainly is a model of collectivity, but I'm not sure if it's a model that's one to be followed. And I'm wondering, I can't think with the other novels if there would be other models. So I mean, I guess I think one of the things that I would love to see is more literature that deals with these issues that's not within a dystopian framework. Although actually Richard Powers' novel Gain is not really a dystopia, although it's certainly very scary. But it's a great question though.
Kind of picks up on that sort of same topic. I wonder about the distinction between corporate capitalism and capitalism, because it seems like one of the implications of the personification of corporations that you're talking about in this paper is precisely that it allows people who would otherwise view the actions of corporations with a great deal of skepticism to see the corporation as an individual entity within a capitalist competitive framework. So, for example, if you look at some of the foundational statements on how capitalism works, like Wealth of Nations,
Right.
Smith was particularly concerned about corporations, about the chartered corporations, because they were monopolies, that because they had state power, because using state violence, they could actually exercise power and effectively prevent competition from happening within a capitalist market. And I'm not defending either.
Yeah.
But I am saying that I think one of the reasons, and this is one of the things that the Cato Institute has been particularly guilty of, and Murray Rothbard, and I can give you some cites on this later.
That'd be great.
Is specifically turning the corporation into a single actor in a capitalist competitive environment.
Yeah.
It's that's actually allowed, I think, for a lot of people, this bizarre model of capitalism, which isn't even capitalism as it was originally conceptualized, to exist, right? I mean, it's completely skewed the balance of power in the marketplace, which goes to your point about the 2 cents versus $2 million marketplace of ideas problem. So I just wonder if nuancing that distinction would, not that you don't do that in the longer project, I'm sure you do, but I wonder if that some of the problem is precisely turning the corporate market that we currently live under, this horrible nightmare existence, into something that looks at a glance like capitalism, but really isn't capitalism at all.
Right.
It's a tyranny, basically.
Right, exactly. And I mean, I'm not sure how long this has been going on, but it certainly seems that the moment that we're living in now, that I mean, I completely agree with you that the way, I mean, the fact that we're getting more and more of these massive mergers, and Amazon and Whole Foods and all of this crazy stuff, that there's, I mean, I think that we are going to be living in this dystopian neoliberal future in like 3 seconds, where there's only going to be a couple corporations, and so there isn't going to be the competition, because of course capitalism is supposed to be fundamentally about competition and fundamentally about individuals. I got kind of hung up on that thing that you were talking about at the beginning, which I think was not your main point, but about turning the corporation into a single actor and this sort of individual, which I think maybe that's part of how the corporations
The danger would
have
be to
an appeal.
divest, to make that distinction would be to divest what she's saying from the history of capitalism.
Yeah, no,
Wouldn't
yeah.
that be,
Yeah.
that's a problem too, I think.
Yeah, but I mean, and I think that part of that, what you're picking up on, and which is something that I think is one of the biggest things that I'm struggling with, is that I'm mostly interested in this sort of corporate form, and specifically in corporate personhood. But I'm always sort of slipping around and I'm talking about capitalism more generally, and I'm always trying to kind of bring it back to the corporate form. But then again, I have this tendency to like set these really ridiculous rules for myself, like this whole thing has to be about this one thing. But I mean, I do think I sort of shift around, and I think especially when I talk about this whole idea of capitalist fundamentalism, because it's actually not even corporate fundamentalism, it's capitalist fundamentalism. But I would love to hear more about the Cato Institute stuff. I think Rachel, and then.
I was really interested in how reproduction is being used, how you're talking about reproduction, because you deal with, obviously the corporate entity is kind of self-reproducing.
Right.
It's this kind of self-perpetuating, this horrible image of this into futurity forever and ever, but without there's no desire, there's no kind of social reproduction, there's no human reproduction.
Right.
But also another flashpoint is Hobby Lobby
Exactly.
case that's actually eroding the kind of reproductive rights of really existing people. I'm interested in the relation, is there a kind of necessary relationship between those two things to begin with, but also thinking about one thing that you're interested in is kind of the kind of models of resistance that might be imagined to call into question this phenomenon of the corporate entity, but I'm thinking about modes of institutionalization that have social reproduction at their core. And so one thing that may or may not be useful is I was thinking quite a lot about how Christopher Newfield has been discussing the university as a site of social reproduction.
Right.
And saying that one of the reasons that privatization has to be so aggressively kind of played out in this site is that it's doing so much, historically has done so much socially reproductive work. And so it's a general question about how you're using reproduction and the kind of relationship between the biological.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, and the reproductive angle, it was something that I want to get into, and I'm not really sure what to say about it, but I was definitely thinking about it a lot, especially with the Hobby Lobby, because it's just not a coincidence that the way that corporations get their foot in the door of religious rights is by curtailing reproductive women's rights over their bodies and ability to make reproductive decisions. So it's not a coincidence at all. But I'm not sure what to do with that. But I think it was very interesting how you were talking about the sort of self-perpetuating nature. And I think perhaps some of the things that I'm thinking about in terms of corporate immortality, I could maybe also think through the idea of the self-perpetuating nature, or the sort of the self-reproductive. And then another thing that I would say that's slightly in response to what you said, and also maybe slightly in response to what Dwight was saying, is I think one thing that needs to be done is we need to figure out a way of redefining. I mean, so even if we're going to have these corporations, why are they defined so much in terms of the money interests? I mean, and I know that there is supposedly this talk about all of these stakeholders, but I mean, I think we need so much more emphasis on the actual workers, and in the Hobby Lobby decision, and this whole elaborate rationale for the corporations having religious freedom is a way of the only way they can even make that argument is by not considering the fact that the women who work at Hobby Lobby are also part of the corporation. I know that's off the topic of reproduction, but I think that's the way to maybe to get at it. And one thing that I did cut from this talk was that Ginsburg has a pretty good but slightly disappointing dissent to the Hobby Lobby decision. I mean, I'm really glad it's there because she makes some excellent points. And shows all kinds of inconsistencies in the majority's reasoning. But unfortunately, she frames the right of the women workers as employee rights, not as reproductive rights. So she doesn't go there at all, and that's the one thing that I was very disappointed. And I'm not sure why she didn't go there, but she didn't.
I mean, I'm guessing for the reasons that Chris was specifying, right?
Yeah.
Because when you're in the corporation, in the space of the corporation, you're nothing but an employee,
Yeah.
right? I mean, you don't have rights that
Yeah.
extend beyond that for the same reason that, NFL players don't have the right to take the knee
Free
within the
speech
space
rights.
of
Right.
the private corporation.
Right. Sir?
Thank you for that. I really like the idea, but I'm concerned about the phrase, the marketplace of ideas. I'm thinking of a book I read by Louis Menard called The Marketplace of Ideas, and it's basically the history of higher education in America. And you could argue that this university is a marketplace of ideas, and you could argue that your favorite independent bookstore, is a marketplace of ideas. And although I completely understand the 2 cents versus 2 billion, that argument is clear.
Yeah.
I don't resonate with the phrase marketplace of ideas for that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just think we need another metaphor, and I'm not sure what it would be, but I think it's really dangerous to put ideas within the realm of an economic exchange. So
Yeah,
that's what disturbs me.
Yeah. Ideas for dollars and cents is really difficult, but
Yeah.
ideas competing against one another is not. And
Right.
I think Louis Menard would argue that that's just business as usual in American academia.
Right. But then business as usual is another. So I mean, It's
another metaphor.
Right,
I know.
and I mean,
Intentional.
and that's after having been thinking about corporate personhood for a couple of years. I mean, I guess I'm maybe because I am trained in literature, but it just really blows me away how powerful these metaphors are, and because I think they do structure our thinking. And I haven't read that book. I mean, it sounds like something that I would very, very much enjoy reading, and probably would agree with a lot of his conclusions. But I don't like the metaphor. And I think that with Citizens United and the fact that it's tied in with this idea that money is itself speech. It's like,
Just a little add-on, the basis of the book is that he was trying to represent the humanities at Harvard University against the colossus of all the sciences. And his experience in sitting at university level communities for about 5 or 10 years translated into a book called The Marketplace of Ideas, used in a positive sense.
yeah. Well, I'm definitely going to have to read that, because actually one of the things, which sounds like so vague, I'm glad I didn't try to put it into my talk, but I think that in trying to make this defense of human beings against corporate persons, I think it actually is very much tied in with the defense of the humanities. And if those of you who have read Super Sad True Love Story know what a big role the humanities play in that novel. So I think it would actually be really useful for me to read that and to see how he uses that metaphor. So thank you. Rachel, Jerry, Bob, I want to get to everyone.
Well, I may be being too complicated here, but it's just something I really wanted to say.
Please.
Building off both what Dwight said and your focus on the notion of self-policing. I mean, what I heard, and I know your defined space is the corporation, but what I couldn't help thinking about was the intersectionality, and you mentioned it yourself, of both the corporation, if you like, and the government, when you talk about
Oh,
Trump.
yeah, oh, yeah.
But also, I keep thinking about that intersectionality of capitalism and communism of the type in 1984, you know, where we have big brother, you know, and
Right.
and I just can't lose that sense of the self-policing as being something that just does, you know, have an intersectionality with other key modes of thought. I mean, that whole Foucauldian notion, you know, of the panopticon. And I
Right.
wondered whether you were just going to, you know, maybe mention it briefly and then define your space elsewhere, or whether you would include, you know, that thought of communism as self-policing, or, you know, I just wondered whether you.
Yeah, no, no, I've been in a sort of a rabbit hole with this. My sister is actually an organizational psychologist, so she gave me all these citations, and I've been slowly reading through them. So I've kind of been in like the rabbit hole of the way that organizational theorists think about it. But I think you're absolutely right that I should take that idea and connect it to things that are certainly much more familiar and important to people in the humanities. And because you're right, the self-policing occurs in a lot of different arenas and has been theorized by a lot of people. Exactly. And it makes me very happy that I'm going to be teaching a class in dystopian literature in the fall. I think it's in the fall for undergrads. Of course, it's sort of the same thing as my human cost of capitalism class, but in a different guise. But I'm going to include 1984 because I haven't read it for 20 years at least, and I really need to go back to it. And now you've made me that much more excited to go back to it. Jerry?
I just want to say thanks, first of all, for the presentation. I thought that was great and really informative and very exciting project. But I just want to say I think the perspective is really a good one, but using the law against literature, because I think what that is going to allow is a nice comparison of ideal capitalism and really existing capitalism. So you see, when Dwight mentioned, you know, that competition is the law of capitalism, I would disagree with that. I'd say that's the ideal of capitalism, but the reality is that capitalism is about accumulation. So, you know, we could say that the corporation comes about as a natural, you know, part of what David Harvey calls as a regime of accumulation at the monopoly stage. So this is capitalism. This isn't some deviation from capitalism. This is what capitalism becomes at a certain level of development. So that was one point. And then the question I wanted to ask you was that I think one of the things that's interesting about the ideal model of capitalism that we see in the Supreme Court rulings about, you know, agents in the marketplace and the equality that's presupposed and all of that, is that it essentially creates a kind of fetishistic view of reality.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Absolutely.
And you know, we talked about, Marx talks about the fetishism of commodities. And I'm thinking, would it be helpful to you to think about the fetishism of corporations? Because we have, in a sense, what Marx was getting at was that this is a kind of primitive mythology, but it's dressed up, obviously, through the price system. And basically what we have is a kind of primitive mythology.
Right.
If we're saying that these entities are like people, that's absurd.
Right.
But we act like that.
Right.
So we're just like a people who believe that if we throw bones on the ground, the rains will come.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So that was really interesting. We live in an irrationalist social world.
Yep.
So that's what the literature is showing us.
Absolutely.
What would you say to that? That's where we are. We live in a world that is actually mythical.
I totally agree.
In a complete sense, with mystique and obfuscation and magic and all the rest of it. But obviously, it's also a tragic world.
I mean, what I would say, I totally agree with it, but I love how you put it because I wouldn't have thought of putting it in those terms. There is a book that a scholar who I use, who I find absolutely fantastic. He's a political economist. I don't know if anyone else here has read him. His name is Martin Koenigs, and he has a fairly recent book called The Emotional Logic of Capitalism. And this, you've read it? Yeah. And the subtitle, so it's on your list like Capitoil, or it's on your pile like Capitoil is on my pile. The subtitle is What Progressives Have Missed. And what he basically is writing about is, and this is very useful for me, especially in dealing with the fundamentalist thing, is the idea that capitalism has become, that its emotional lore is the same as that of a religion. And he has this whole, I mean, and his argument has a lot to do with the difference between idols versus icons. But so I've been thinking about that issue through him, but you're absolutely right that I should think about it through Marx and talk about fetishism and the fact that it is completely irrational. So
I was also thinking of Adorno and Horkheimer, you know, we're in a new age of myth.
right. No, that's great. Thank you.
Well, so coming a little bit off of that, and this might be a little bit in left field, but thinking about the return of religion, at least in Oryx and Crate, and I'm thinking too, like the parable of the sower and other,
Yeah.
other things, there's the return or the creation of this sort of collective ego spirituality, right? And if you are thinking about the university versus the individual, I wonder too if the environment is showing up at all, and sort of the return to nature, however we conceive that. Because if the zero-sum game is one of life, death, immortality, all of that is still premised upon the existence of an earth, which the corporations are rapidly destroying.
Right.
Resources. Yeah, and so I know in the sequel to Oryx and Crake, there's the green
Gardeners?
yeah, the gardeners, and then in the Butler, there's Earth, right? That's part of it. So I'm wondering if that's showing up in other places, or if that's something that you thought about.
I think it's super important. I haven't really done much with it, but I also think of The Road, which doesn't really deal with the corporation, but I mean I think it's very much within this tradition. And there are moments like when the boy and the man find like a Coke bottle, and so I mean there are moments, and there's a scene where he picks up some coins and they're completely irrelevant. So I mean, there are allusions to the fact that the whole capitalist thing has been destroyed, but that somehow the earth is still there. So I think of that, and also.
Well, on such a full sea.
I was just going to say, yeah, on such a full sea, and I don't know what you were thinking of, but I was thinking of especially like the fish in the water, being so important, and the fish as a,
when they want to revolt and they
right.
throw crap in the pond.
Exactly. But the fish are being raised as a commercial product, but then the main character Fan has a relationship with the water and with the fish, which seems much more sort of organic and authentic. So I think that it definitely is something that is connected to these other issues in some of these books. So, but if you think of any others, please let me know. Bob and Haley?
Fascinating talk, and I'm really excited about this project. I was thinking so much as you were opening up your lecture about the scene in The Grapes of Wrath, which probably a lot of people remember, when I think it's Pa Joe wants to go shoot somebody who's taking his land away from him. And there's this whole chapter about there's nobody to shoot. You can't find a human body to shoot because the corporation has no body.
Right.
And I found that, I don't know, I've always found that to be an extremely powerful scene. And I'm wondering if, it does seem like a lot of your project involves bodies.
Right.
And it does seem that the corporation, because of its bodilessness, or it's a corporation, which goes back to the word for body, of course, but it has no body that can be wounded, that can starve, that can die.
Right.
So there's some central, I don't know, it just seems to me that you're really onto something with that kind of how bodies work and how the corporation claims to be one without one.
Right.
There's so many contradictions layered on top of each other that it's pretty maddening. But I just think you're getting at a lot of really great fundamental things.
Well, thank you for mentioning that scene in Grapes of Wrath, because that is perfect. And it's been kind of one thing that's been just sort of ironic is that in trying to get my I got into this because I wanted to read contemporary literature. I didn't know I was going to end up writing about any of this stuff. But the further I got into contemporary literature, then I want to write about this. But then of course it turns out that I have to go back so many, but particularly go back to the progressive era, which is where I worked for like the last 30 years of my life. So I want to get away from it, but I can't. But yeah, I need to go back to the Grapes of Wrath, even though I hate that book. But maybe I'll like it now. You've given me a reason to look back at it. And Kaylee and Patrick and Kathleen?
So I apologize if this is off topic, but
No.
I absolutely loved your talk. I want
Thank
to
you.
echo Bob there as well. This made me think of something that I talked about with my students today. So it reminded me very much of Hollingsworth v. Perry, the Proposition 8 case, in which the state wouldn't go to repeal it or go to appeal it, so they had corporations step in. And at the same time, kind of towards the closing testimonies, the question became about whether or not marriage benefited the state if it was between same-sex couples. So the idea of like having to reproduce and whether or not reproduction could happen organically and naturally became a question that was kind of falling apart there in the way that it was defined. And then this gets fictionalized into Dustin Lance Black's play 8, which is just a recording of the court transcript with some narrativization in there that is then used to get money to fund additional legal causes for this. So it makes me think of this kind of weird symbiotic relationship between literature and law that you're really getting at, and this idea of like how the individual is both supporting the state and how the corporation is stepping in on behalf of the state. It doesn't necessarily fit with corporate personhood, but it's definitely kind of knocking on a lot of doors in my head.
That's fascinating. Hollingsworth, I haven't read this.
Versus Perry.
Yeah. Thank you. That sounds great. And you said that the transcript was made in.
Yeah, the closing closing arguments, I think, is Dustin Lance Black, and the play is just named 8.
That sounds great. Thank you, Haley. Patrick.
Thanks. I just wanted to build off what Bob said in terms of like a corporation doesn't have a body, it can kill, but it can't murder because it doesn't have that consciousness or conscience, and therefore it can't meet the malice requirement of first-degree murder. Also, it can't be killed in any form of punishment. It really just gets passed on to the consumers because fines are about the only thing that can be done.
Kathleen and Brandon.
This is just a quick kind of like medievalist thing. I was thinking that telescoping history that you can do might really find useful, and I'm sure you already know Kantorovich in The King's Two Bodies, where really that first whole chapter kind of digs into the canon law and kind of how this idea of kind of a corporate role around a political corporate role kind of emerged. Mm-hmm. But the other thing that made me think about was that canon law really thinks about the ethics of labor, at least kind of the really old stuff does. And it's very skeptical of profit, particularly usury, as White knows, but it's very interested and invested in kind of how we use labor and the outcome and what we do with like kind of the excessiveness of profit. But now we're at a moment where we're really talking about the ethos of profit. Like we're moved from the ethics of labor to the ethos of profit. And I was thinking particularly like your ruminations about Steingart's book,
Superset.
And Gain. Gain is interesting because it's kind of, it stops just short of our current moment where you have these really abstract kind of forms of labor like Facebook and Google, which have these ethos attached to them in a really personal way.
Right.
And so like Mark Zuckerberg, we just learned that he has like $7.5 million in personal security, right, for the last year and a half, because like Zuckerberg as a personality is so important.
Right.
And that company kind of makes money, as does Starbucks, as does Google, through these like weird kind of not ethical appeals, but like ethos appeals.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so like Google's do no harm. It sounds ethical, but it's really about an ethos. It's about profit making.
Right.
So that slip is really a sort of, it's seamless and it goes by really fast, but it relies in a weird way on this idea of kind of person.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
And there's an American Studies book, I don't know how far back it goes, a couple decades, I don't know if you've read it, Chris, called Creating the Corporate Soul by Roland Marchand, which deals with probably like, I think probably maybe like 1940s through 1970s, and like huge corporations, but trying to make themselves look better, and a lot of it focusing on advertising and like lots of glossy pictures and stuff. But it would definitely be worth my while to sort of think that through to the present moment.
Well, and the way that collectives can police back, so that you know you have the Parkland kids saying, you know what, if you advertise on Laura Ingraham, you're going to lose this many customers. So that becomes a way of fighting back a corporate identity that says it's something is being policed by people who themselves now have a collective by way of followers.
Right. But I have not read The King's Two Bodies, so thank you for that.
Oh, just that first chapter.
No, it sounds great.
Useful.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Parkland survivors.
Brandon had a question.
Yeah.
I don't want to stop the conversation.
No, no.
That'll be our last question, and then we'll informally ask Claire to answer questions.
I'm interested in this as a book project, especially kind of thinking like Dwight and Chris talked earlier in the semester. It sounds like an interdisciplinary project. I'm wondering if you're hoping to kind of get some legal scholars reading this.
Definitely.
Yes.
And Sarah actually told me about this wonderful conference that meets every March in Georgetown. It's a law, culture, and humanities conference. And I got to tell you that the law professors are so much nicer than English professors. I mean, present company excluded. But, you know, you go to conferences and like somebody who's like a big shot will like not make eye contact with you. But these people were so fantastic. So that I was kind of getting my foot in the door that way. But I absolutely want. I mean, I always tend to sort of publish kind of like outside of my field a little bit, and so it's very important to me that this stuff isn't just, you know, my making the stuff up. That and you know, and there's so much that I don't understand about the law that it's really kind of intimidating. But yes, it definitely is going to be interdisciplinary, and I definitely want lawyers in on it.
Well, if you have questions, I'll urge you to ask them informally to Claire, and to have some more food and coffee and drinks and stuff over there. Unfortunately, no vodka as far as I know. But and thanks. Let's give Claire.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for your patience and your wonderful comments and questions. It was super helpful. Appreciate it.
Really interesting project.